Your teeth are keeping a record, not of what you ate this week, of the worst 6 months of your childhood, held permanently in enamel, about half a millimeter below the surface. You cannot edit it, you cannot heal it, and in 4,000 years, if somebody digs you up, it will be the first thing they read. Here's why enamel makes such a good witness. Almost every tissue you own is under constant renovation. Skin sheds, blood replaces itself, even bone dissolves and rebuilds throughout your entire life, quietly, without asking you. Enamel does none of that. It is laid down once, in layers, while you are still growing, and then it is finished forever. So when a child is seriously ill, or seriously hungry, or fighting a parasite load their body can't win against, enamel production stalls. When it starts again, it leaves a horizontal groove running around the tooth. Archaeologists call it linear enamel hypoplasia. In plain English, a scar on a tooth marking the point where growth stopped. And here's what makes it more than a scar. Teeth grow in a known order, from the tip of the crown downward toward the root, at a fairly predictable rate. So the position of the groove tells you roughly how old that child was when their life went wrong. 2 grooves means it happened twice. A whole ladder of them means a childhood that kept getting interrupted. Now compare that to the rest of the skeleton, because bone is the opposite kind of witness. Bone is constantly torn down and rebuilt, which means it mostly remembers the last few years of your life and slowly forgets the rest. Teeth remember your childhood and never let go. So an archaeologist holding your remains is reading 2 different clocks at once. One tells them how your last years went. The other tells them how you started. What else is in there? Diet, for one, and not in a vague way. Bone collagen carries chemical signatures inherited from your food, and 2 of them do most of the work. Carbon can distinguish broad categories of plants, separating people who lived on wheat and barley from people who lived on maize or millet. Nitrogen climbs the higher up the food chain you eat. Regular meat, dairy, and fish push the nitrogen signal up. A life built on grain and not much else leaves it lower. Which means a cemetery can be sorted by diet, and diets in almost every society that has ever existed sort by class. Origin is in there too. The water you drank as a child carried dissolved elements from the rock it passed through, and strontium and oxygen from that water were built straight into your enamel. Match the ratios to a geological map, and you get a rough answer to where a person spent their early years. This is how archaeologists identify migrants in a burial ground full of locals, or discover that the person in the richest grave wasn't from anywhere nearby. Then there is the body as a machine that was used. Heavy, repetitive labor leaves traces. Joints wear unevenly. The spine compresses. The places where muscle attaches to bone can build up where they were pulled on hardest, year after year. A skeleton that hauled, lifted, and ground grain for 30 years does not look like a skeleton that didn't. But be careful here, because this is exactly where the field learned to be humble. Bone responds to activity, age, body size, injury, and genetics all at once. And separating the signal of work from everything else is genuinely difficult. Where is a clue? It is not a job title. The clearest picture comes when all of these lines point the same way at once. And one of the sites where that first happened is a place in Illinois called Dixon Mounds. Alan Goodman and George Armalagos studied the skeletons buried there across a major transition, as the community shifted toward intensive maize agriculture and closer ties to a larger trade center. The conventional story says farming is progress. The bones said something colder. In the later group, enamel defects became more common. So did signs of infection and anemia. Life expectancy went down, not up. More food concentrated in fewer hands, worse health for the people at the bottom. So the method works, except there's a trap inside it, and it took the field decades to see. In 1992, James Wood, George Milner, Henry Harpending, and Kenneth Weiss published a paper laying out what became known as the osteological paradox. The argument runs like this. A lesion on a bone takes time to form, which means a skeleton covered in stress markers belongs to somebody whose body was resilient enough to survive the stress and then record it. The person who was hit by the same illness and died in a fortnight leaves behind a perfectly smooth, perfectly healthy-looking skeleton. Read that again because it inverts everything. The unmarked bones in a cemetery may not be the lucky ones. They may be the most fragile people there. Does that ruin the whole project? No, it sharpens it, and the sharpest use of it might be Sharon DeWitt's work with James Wood on a plague cemetery at East Smithfield in London, one of the burial grounds opened specifically for the Black Death. The assumption for centuries was that the plague was indiscriminate, a scythe that took whoever it touched. DeWitt compared the plague dead against people who died before the epidemic and found that it wasn't indiscriminate at all. Individuals who already carried skeletal signs of poor health were more likely to be among the dead. The pathogen didn't check anyone's status. It didn't have to. It arrived in a city where some people had spent their childhoods hungry, and the record of those childhoods was already sitting in their teeth. So what does a skeleton actually tell you? Not wealth. There is no bone that stores a bank balance. What it stores is hardship, written as interrupted growth, thinner diets, heavier work, illness survived, and illness not survived. Poverty never shows up directly. It shows up as the reason all of those things kept happening to the same people. And that is the uncomfortable part. Money is the most temporary thing about a society. The coins corrode, the ledgers rot, the deeds burn. What lasts is the physical difference the money made to the bodies of the people who did and didn't have it. And that difference is durable enough to still be legible when nothing else about that world survives. Your teeth are keeping a record. They just haven't finished deciding what it will say.